In September 2018, Milan found itself at the center of a scandal that shook the entire city. Luca Moreno, the 35-year-old chef of the popular restaurant La Piazza, was found dead in the establishment's storage room. His sudden death raised more questions than answers. Young and charismatic, Luca had become a star in the culinary world thanks to his unique dishes and warm hospitality. His smile drew customers in, and his talent kept them returning to their tables. Yet behind his brilliant reputation lay complicated, personal relationships that might have proven fatal. That night, the restaurant closed at 10 p.m. Waiter Marco Bianchi was finishing his shift when he realized that Luca was nowhere to be found. At first, Marco thought the chef had simply gone home early, but soon he discovered Luca's body in the storage room. The quiet restaurant instantly turned into a crime scene. Panic, confusion, and screams pierced the evening silence. Detectives Elena Ricci and Giorgio Ferrari arrived on the scene at 10:45 p.m. At first glance, it seemed like just another case. However, within minutes, it was clear that things were far more complicated. There were no obvious signs of death, no evidence of violence or struggle, but Elena's intuition told her this was no accident. The bright lights illuminated every movement in the dark kitchen, where the scent of freshly prepared dishes still lingered. Elena carefully surveyed the scene, looking for anything that might explain the tragedy. Stains on the floor, a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter, a discarded towel. These details could mean everything, or nothing at all. Marco Bianchi's statement didn't provide much clarity. He hadn't noticed anything suspicious that evening, though he did mention that Luca had seemed down lately. In recent weeks, frequent arguments had flared between him and two women, Clara Bellini and Maria Rossi. Clara, a designer with a fiery temperament, was more than just a lover to Luca, and Maria, his former business partner, might have had her own grudges. Elena and Giorgio reviewed the surveillance footage. Only shadows and blurry figures. No one entered or exited through the main door during the time Luca was last seen alive. Yet the detectives knew the real answers lay with the people who knew Luca best. Tension was building. While the city buzzed with rumors, the detectives remained cold and focused. The investigation was only beginning, but it was already clear that Luca Moreno's death was no accident. They would have to delve into a dark world of jealousy, resentment, and betrayal to uncover who decided that the talented chef had to disappear. Marco Bianchi's interrogation began early in the morning at the police station. He looked pale and nervous. His fingers trembled constantly, and his eyes darted around the room anxiously. He wasn't just a witness. He knew Luca better than anyone else on the restaurant staff. "Were you the last person to see Luca alive?" Elena Ricci asked calmly, her gaze sharp as a knife. "Yes. He said he'd stay for another hour after closing." Marco swallowed the lump in his throat. It was normal for him. He liked being alone when the restaurant was empty. Giorgio Ferrari leaned forward, studying the waiter's face carefully. "Did you notice anything unusual recently? Did anyone have conflicts with Luca?" Giorgio asked. Marco wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and hesitated before answering. "Yes, there were. Clara Bellini often came by late in the evening. They had arguments. One time I heard her screaming that she would never forgive him for his betrayal." Elena and Giorgio exchanged glances. Clara Bellini was next on their list to interview. Her name had already come up in various statements, but now she was becoming a prime suspect. They met Clara in her small studio where she was working on sketches for new collections. The room smelled of paint and coffee. Clara looked exhausted, her eyes red as if she hadn't slept all night. "I've already told the police everything." "Why are you here again?" Her voice was firm, but her hands betrayed her nervousness. "Tell us about what was happening between you and Luca recently," Elena asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Clara sighed and looked away. "We had problems. I knew about his meetings with Maria. It was unbearable. He assured me it was over, but I didn't believe him." "Did you go to La Piazza that evening?" Giorgio interjected, his gaze locked onto hers. Clara raised her head, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Yes, I went. I wanted to talk to him, but I left before the restaurant closed. I didn't do anything to him." Her voice trembled, and for a moment panic flickered in her eyes. Elena noticed and made a note in her notebook. Her instincts told her Clara was hiding more than she was saying. "Could you describe in detail what happened during your last conversation?" Elena asked gently. Clara held her breath and whispered, I just told him I couldn't go on like this, that if he wanted to be with Maria, I would leave his life. But I didn't kill him. Her voice was filled with despair. Elena and Giorgio left the studio, feeling that the truth was close. But the evidence wasn't yet enough to accuse Clara. The investigation was picking up momentum, and each step revealed new layers of hidden secrets. The next morning, detectives Elena Ricci and Giorgio Ferrari headed to Maria Rossi's apartment. Luca Moreno's former business partner lived in an old building on the outskirts of Milan. The door was opened by a slender woman with a cold gaze and dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Maria looked calm, but her eyes betrayed deep fatigue and hidden pain. Come in, she said briefly. The apartment was impeccably clean, but the air was thick with tension. Maria sat across from the detectives, her arms crossed, waiting for their questions. Ms. Rossi, we need to clarify a few details about your relationship with Luca, Elena began, observing Maria's reaction. Of course, Maria replied, her voice even and almost emotionless. You were connected not only personally but also professionally. What happened between you two? Giorgio asked, holding his notebook. Maria stared out the window before answering. We started out together. La Piazza was our dream, but Luca, he always wanted more. When our relationship fell apart, he decided he didn't need me anymore, neither in his life nor in the business. He bought out my share and pushed me out. Her words dripped with bitterness. Elena noticed Maria's fingers clenching into a fist. Did you resent him for that? Elena asked directly. Maria looked the detective straight in the eye. Yes, I was disappointed. He destroyed my life, then acted like I never existed. But I didn't wish him dead. No matter what, it was still our run. Where were you on the night of the incident? Giorgio's voice was calm but firm. At home, I was working on a new project. You can check if you want, Maria replied, but her nervous gestures betrayed the tension beneath her calm facade. Giorgio made a few notes while Elena continued. Have you had any contact with Luca recently? Yes, he texted me. He wanted to meet and talk about our past. Maria shrugged. I refused. There was nothing left to say. A silence hung in the room. Maria's answers sounded logical, but the detective sensed there was more beneath the surface. She maintained her composure, but her eyes reflected an inner struggle. After the interview, Elena and Giorgio left the apartment. Giorgio was the first to break the silence. She's hiding something. Maybe not everything, but something about her story felt rehearsed. Elena nodded. Yes, her pain is real. But is it enough to lead to murder? We need to dig deeper. They knew solving this case would require uncovering many more secrets. And with each step, the true picture of Luca's death was becoming more complicated. Elena Ricci sat in the dimly lit office of the investigation unit, her eyes fixed on the computer monitor. Surveillance footage from the cameras near La Piazza played on the screen. Timestamps flashed one after another, but nothing seemed suspicious. Yet one scene caught her attention. A figure in a long, dark coat appeared on the screen, standing several meters from the restaurant, nearly blending into the twilight. The face was hidden by a hood and the hands were buried deep in the coat pockets. The figure remained still for several minutes before walking away slowly. Elena rewound the footage and studied the figure's movements. There was something familiar about the posture, the slight tension in the shoulders. Her intuition whispered that this might be Maria Rossi, but she couldn't be sure. Giorgio Ferrari entered the office, holding a folder with new witness statements. He paused behind Elena, watching the screen intently. Did you find something? He asked. Maybe. Look at this figure. I can't shake the feeling it's Maria, Elena replied, pointing to the footage. Giorgio frowned and sat down beside her. It could be Milan, but there's more. I spoke to Sofia Rendi, one of the restaurant's waitresses. She mentioned seeing Clara Bellini near the back entrance that evening. Elena raised her eyebrows. Two suspects, two women with motives. Now both of them had been seen near the crime scene on that fateful night. We need to talk to Clara again, Elena said. It's starting to look like she's hiding something. The interrogation of Clara Bellini took place in a small witness room. Clara looked drained, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her sweater. She avoided making eye contact with the detectives. Clara, witnesses saw you near the back entrance of the restaurant that night, Elena began, her voice calm but firm. You told us you left earlier. Why didn't you tell us the truth? Clara's lips quivered and she trembled. Panic flashed across her face. I, I was there, but it's not what you think, she stammered. I wanted to talk to Luca, but I changed my mind. I just stood there for a few minutes and then left. Did you see anyone else near the restaurant? Giorgio asked. Clara shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. No, there was no one. Elena studied her face closely. Clara's words sounded convincing, yet something still didn't add up. The sense of deception was almost palpable. Clara, if you know something important, it's better to tell us now, Elena added. Clara sighed, a tear rolling down her cheek. I've told you everything I know. Elena and Giorgio exchanged glances. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but some details still didn't fit. The forensic lab revealed new details that shifted the direction of the investigation. Elena Ricci examined the report with the test results, her fingers drumming anxiously on the table. Clara Bellini's fingerprints had been found on the handle of the back entrance to La Piazza. This wasn't definitive proof of her guilt, but it confirmed that she was much closer to the scene of the crime than she had admitted. We knew she was lying, Giorgio Ferrari muttered as he looked at the crime scene photos. Now we have confirmation that she was there. Elena nodded, but her eyes were focused elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the real cause of this tragedy was buried deeper. But it still doesn't prove she killed him. It only shows that she was there, Elena replied. We need more information. Maybe someone close to her knows more. Elena decided to speak with Clara's friend, Elisabetta Franco. Elisabetta was an architect, and though she appeared calm on the surface, it was clear she was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. They met in a small cafe on Dante Street. Elisabetta sat across from Elena, her hands folded in her lap. We know Clara has been under a lot of stress lately, Elena began gently. Did she talk to you about her relationship with Luca? Elisabetta sighed, her gaze filled with sorrow. She was at her breaking point, Elisabetta whispered. She said she was losing control of the situation. She was afraid Luca would go back to Maria. She was obsessed with that fear. What do you mean by obsessed? Elena asked, leaning forward slightly. She couldn't think about anything else. She kept saying that if he left her, her life would be ruined. I've never seen her like that before. She was desperate. Elisabetta looked away, her fingers tightening. Elena noted everything and asked directly, do you think she could have done something irreversible? Elisabetta paused, her face contorted with inner conflict. I don't know, she finally answered, tears glistening in her eyes. But she wasn't herself. This wasn't the Clara I knew. Elena returned to the station where Giorgio was waiting for her. What do you think? He asked, watching her expectantly. She might have snapped. Desperation, jealousy, fear. All of it could have pushed her to do something terrible, Elena replied, sinking into a chair. Now we need a confession, Giorgio added. We're close, but we're not there yet. We need to push her toward the truth, Elena said quietly. The truth was within reach, but no one was ready to speak it out loud just yet. Clara Bellini sat in the interrogation room, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. Her face looked drained and hollow. Detectives Elena Ricci and Giorgio Ferrari watched her silently through the one-way glass. The tension in the air was almost tangible. She's on the edge, Giorgio whispered. Just a bit more, and she'll break. Elena nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped into the room. She sat across from Clara, placing her notebook gently on the table. Clara, we know you were at the back entrance of the restaurant that night. Your fingerprints were found on the door handle. We need the truth, Elena said softly but firmly. Clara shuddered, her fingers nervously gripping the hem of her sweater. She lifted her eyes to meet Elena's, not with defiance, but with desperation and sorrow. I didn't mean for this to happen, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. It was a terrible mistake. Tell us what happened that night, Elena encouraged, her voice low and soothing, creating a safe space for the confession. Clara exhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as though she were trying to inhale more air than her lungs could hold. I went to the restaurant to talk to Luca, she began. I wanted to understand what was happening between us. We'd been arguing constantly. He told me he wanted to go back to Maria, that our relationship was a mistake. Her voice cracked, and tears rolled down her cheeks. What happened next? Elena asked gently. I couldn't believe what he was saying. Everything we had built together was crumbling before my eyes. I begged him to reconsider. But Clara sobbed. He told me it was over, that he didn't want to see me again. She covered her face with her hands, trying to stifle her sobs. Elena gave her a moment before continuing. And then what? I lost control, Clara whispered. I don't even remember how it happened. I pushed him. He fell. He hit his head on a metal shelf. She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. I didn't want this. I didn't plan to kill him. It was an accident. Elena stayed silent, allowing Claire's confession to settle in the room. Her words were filled with raw emotion. She wasn't a cold-blooded killer, just a woman overwhelmed by pain she couldn't handle. You left him there and ran? Giorgio asked, having listened carefully to their conversation. Clara nodded. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. It felt like my life was over too. Elena turned off the recorder. The confession had been made. Clara had crumbled under the weight of her emotions and the inescapable truth. All that was left now was to prepare the case for court. They left the room, the door closing behind them. The investigation was over, but relief was hard to find. The trial of Clara Bellini became one of the most high-profile cases Milan had seen in years. The courtroom was packed with journalists, Luca Moreno's colleagues, and ordinary citizens who couldn't believe that desperation and jealousy had led to such a tragedy. Clara sat on the defendant's bench, dressed in a somber, dark suit. She looked calm, but her eyes were empty. Her lawyer argued that it was an accident, a result of temporary loss of control due to emotional stress. The prosecutor, however, emphasized that Clara knowingly pursued confrontation, understanding the risks it posed. Elena Ricci and Giorgio Ferrari sat at the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings. Their work was done, but every word, every argument dragged them back to that fateful night. They knew that the truth didn't always bring relief. Ms. Bellini, the judge's voice was stern but fair, this court finds you guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Luca Moreno and sentences you to 15 years in prison. A silence settled over the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck, sealing the tragic fate. Clara didn't resist, didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply bowed her head, accepting her destiny. Maria Rossi was among those present. She watched Clara with an expression that seemed to ask how things could have gone so wrong. Her life had been forever changed, too. Luca was more than just a business partner to her. His death had taken away a part of her soul. After the hearing, Elena and Giorgio stepped out onto the bustling street. The sun shone brightly, but for them, the day was cloaked in shadows. Do you think she'll ever forgive herself? Elena asked quietly, watching Clara being led to the police van. Giorgio shrugged. I don't know. Sometimes the harshest punishment is living with what you've done. La Piazza closed after Luca's death. Its doors remain locked, windows covered in dust. What was once a symbol of success, joy, and inspiration had become a reminder of the fragility of human relationships and how easily everything could crumble. Maria decided to leave Milan. The memories were too painful. She sold her apartment and moved to another city to start anew. But even in a new place, the shadows of the past would always stay with her. Elena Ricci reflected on the case for a long time. It taught her how powerful emotions could cloud judgment and lead to irreversible consequences. They were all victims, in a way. Luca, Clara, Maria, trapped by their feelings, unspoken grievances, and the inability to let go of the past. This story ended in tragedy, but it could have been different. If only one of them had stopped, taken a step back, and chosen to forgive.